Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. And this is Insight. Insight is the show where we usually discuss books on politics, public affairs, domestic, foreign. Today's book isn't really any of that. It's one of these books that we periodically like to discuss on the show, which is about how to think. And this is a book written by Maria Konnikova, and the title of the book is called Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. Joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Sonja Blair. To Sonja's right is Daniel Gilmore. And to Daniel's right is Maria Sanchez. Now, I wanted to start by reading an opening quote from the book, just so you can get a sense of what the book is about, and then we'll jump into a discussion about what she's written. So, the author writes, "The steps to 221B Baker Street. How many were there? It's the question Holmes brought before Dr. Watson. The detective instructs the doctor on the difference between seeing and observing. What Holmes had been doing for most of his life was honing a method of mindful interaction with the world. What is needed is a mindful interaction. This can help us become more insightful, more creative, and more productive. For Sherlock Holmes, mindful presence is just a first step. It's a means to a far larger, far more practical goal. What Holmes is really telling Watson when he contrasts seeing and observing is to never mistake mindlessness for mindfulness, a passive approach with an active involvement. When we are forced to observe, we are forced to pay attention. We have to move from passive absorption to active awareness. We have to engage."
When it comes to the ending of the quote, when you said when we are forced to observe, we are forced to pay attention, I really agree with that, because I think as people today, we try our best to engage with things. We need to try our best to engage with things better, because I think we're passive listeners. And so I think when you get a situation where you are forced to observe, that helps you pay attention better.
I feel that the quote sums up the entirety of the book, because it focuses largely focuses on not just seeing, but using your different senses and mindfulness in order to deduce things, which is the conclusion of the book, is deduction is the most important part of problem solving.
Oh, see, this it identifies a stair example where Holmes is aware of 17 stairs, whereas Watson constantly goes up these stairs and has no clue of how many stairs there were. He just continually interacts with it. This is something, a significant factor into psychology. We interact with something daily, but yet we do not fully see it. In a way, we set ourselves into this default mode. Once we think we familiarize it, we think that's the whole picture there is. We can take party affiliation, for example. People vote for the party we have familiarized with ourselves, yet whether that be through family or friends and such. And their political affiliation, we interact with this, it just sets ourselves into a mode, and we don't think further than that. We don't bother what our party is actually doing. We just generally agree with it because we think that that's all we see there is to it. And that's what the author's trying to get at, is that we need to expand our thinking, see what actually policies our party is interacting with and who we're actually voting for, and further research into that.
Yeah, the book is sort of a way to think about thinking, which I guess is the way you really might want to put it. And so I thought it was interesting. Towards the beginning of the book, they went through a situation where Arthur Conan Doyle, the author, is sort of acting like Sherlock Holmes. He is investigating a series of murders, and so as a result you have these 16 mutilations that take place in 1903, and as a result he's going along with the idea, saying the guy that they picked is wrong. Now we're going to try to find out who the real killer is, and he helps the process along to sort of change directions to sort of uncover the truth.
I wanted to comment on when you said that this book is making us think like a thinker. I think that this book, she wants us to think like Sherlock Holmes. And before reading this book, I heard of Sherlock Holmes. I really didn't know who he was, so I had to go research. And so I think that this book, I found out that Sherlock Holmes was a detective that was solving murders. And so I was like, that's a real crazy way for someone to want us to think, like someone that's solving murders. But after learning about Sherlock Holmes, I think he's very like a visionary. And I think his thoughts are very unique, and he uses psychology to get his thoughts together. So I think that I think she definitely using Sherlock Holmes as like the way, as like an example for us to think. I think that was right on when she used that.
Yeah, they periodically, you're going to remake Sherlock Holmes movies, or sometimes even a TV series. So the one I'm most familiar with was an actor by the name of Basil Rathbone. This is going back to the 1940s. And then periodically over the years, you continue to have other people make movies, and they update and they keep updating them. And so my guess is you'll see that from now on, is you're going to periodically, every few years, there'll be another Sherlock Holmes TV series or show, or there'll be another Sherlock Holmes movie. So it's sort of like he lives forever in TV land and movie land. And so as a result, in this case, she's sort of drawing from his writings and then using the book to sort of say, here's how he thought through things, and what can we do from using the way he's in the Arthur Conan Doyle novels to sort of look at what we need to look at, life around us, and sort of improve our ability to think.
Yeah, we have to observe and not just see. Now, the first three parts of the book focus mostly on the neurology and psychology of Sherlock Holmes' methods and how to apply them. It's only at the fourth and final part that Konnikova goes in depth on the methodology and applications of the techniques that she explained in the first three parts.
I want to add on to Daniel's point of like we have to really observe and really dig further into it. Like for example, in a political sense, when we look at Reagan today, a lot of Republicans would consider him one of the greatest conservative like presidents and such. You know, some of them even like talk about him religiously. You know, we see the term Reaganism and such, but you know, the conservative ideals of associating less government intervention and such is associated with Reagan, but yet we see Reagan having his administration do more intervening, such as the Chrysler bailout in 1979, where the government interfered and let Chrysler have a $1.5 billion in loans, and with the ideals of conservatism, we typically associated with capitalism and the free market, let it run, let the company just go into it. But yet we have Reagan, who's associated with conservatism, and then we have government intervention in it.
When I'm looking at some stuff out of the book, precisely, he has this quote. He says, "There is nothing new under the sun. It has all been done before." And this sort of is a quote that sort of allows then her to talk about something she calls the knowledge base. And the knowledge base is how you're trying to have these things where you're becoming aware of things from the past so that you can apply them to reasoning now. And so then she goes through sort of taking, again, different Sherlock Holmes situations, cases he was involved with, and saying, okay, so now we can move from there to begin to talk about what does that knowledge base mean? How do we begin the process of then saying, how do we take something that has already happened and sort of apply it to a reasoning situation?
And what happened was a murder that was similar to the last one. It was a new one, is what he was referring to in that quote, just to specify.
I want to, again, take this to more of a political sense, just me applying it, with this quote, "There's nothing new under the sun." I look into past model, like we see now with Trump trying to impose a business model like into our political system, and people are seeing it as, oh, this is something new, something we haven't seen before. And yet we see this Mayor Fiola LaGuardia in 1938, this quote, he says, "I seek to run the government as an honest man, attempts to run his business and to live with my revenue." Same like today is we're not exposed to new ideas. We have to, again, with this book, observe and research more, and we have to like expand our knowledge to see that we have to come up with new ideas, or at least be aware of that these ideas already exist.
One of the ways I think she was looking at this knowledge base is she then ties it into what she calls a natural skepticism. That's not to be cynical or sarcastic, but skepticism in the sense that you stop and question something, and that just by questioning you begin to look at something that you maybe looked at before, but you're bringing a new sort of sense of eyes to it and looking at it by just not assuming, and that as a result you stop and think it through, and it allows you to sort of not take things at face value.
There was a quote in the book that says we first need to overcome a sort of natural resistance that provides the way that we see the world. And that quote really stuck out to me because I definitely think that, like when Maria brought up earlier, like our political beliefs, how they are, I feel like they are morally based, and how you grow up is basically how you see the world, like with your own morals and your own beliefs, and how your parents raised you is really how you see the world. Like if you were raised Democratic, you'll probably still be a Democrat later on in life. And so I thought that quote stuck out to me the most because it was right on about how, how we see the world, our natural being is how we see the world.
Any comment?
Yeah, we have a confirmation bias that we need to overcome is essentially what that means. The verification process.
All right, yeah, and that's what she's bringing up. She's talking about the idea that we tend to accept something, and by accepting it, we're not sort of necessarily verifying whether, in fact, something is absolutely true. Now, it's difficult to always do that, and she explains that also in the book. But the idea of just sort of saying something and then realizing, wait a minute, I heard it, but how do I know it's true? Shouldn't I take the time to maybe see whether or not something like that has actually been stated, or whether there's some sort of validity to what's just been said? And this is part of her trying to say it's okay to have a natural skepticism. And so the natural skepticism can lead you to the next logical step, which is to verify something rather than to just accept it.
Yeah, there are many cases where we encounter an article or a news headline or just something that just speaks out to us, and we just tend to believe that certain headline or just that certain information we get, and we don't go through the verification process she mentions. We have to look at other sources, look at something that we might not be exposed to, go to the extent of us wanting to further our knowledge and see others' perspectives, because we only, as you say, we're only exposed to certain things, like being socialized in a only Democratic family or only Republican family or something in between, and we only just stick to the ideals. And we have to go through the verification process of expanding our knowledge and looking into other sources that we are not typically exposed to.
Yeah, this is the age of technology, and everyone is just always looking on social media to get their information. And even myself, I find a lot of times, like, I just read stuff and automatically believe it. And dealing with social media, you have to be skeptical about everything that you see. But because everybody just typically believes what they see on social media and get their news from social media newscasts, they just automatically think that, like, that's believable just because it was on the news. That's true. And I do think that when she was talking about how you need to be skeptical, that's right. Like, you should be skeptical, and there's nothing wrong with being skeptical.
And thankfully, there's a lot of different news sources you could be getting that information from. So if you want to be skeptical, just subscribe to, I don't know, Fox News and BuzzFeed,
And that comes with the problem that she mentions, that we just set ourselves into this default mode where we have untrained brains and we're not taking the initiative to actually go train our brains. Just like a sport, the way we want to get better, we keep practicing and showing up. And she mentions that as, for us to train our brains, we have to keep looking, not just believing the first thing we see. We have to, okay, maybe let's look at something that I typically don't encounter. And that's very important that she mentions in that.
Yeah, the untrained brain part, where she says the good news is you can train your brain. And this has nothing to do with, say, a formal education. It's just a process of how you sit down and start the process of thinking through something. And she's simply trying to show you, I'm trying to give you sort of a roadmap through this book about how to think about thinking. And as a result, you're doing such things such as being skeptical, you're trying to verify, and then she starts to say, and by the end of the book, what would Sherlock Holmes do? What would he do in this situation, and what would you do? And so essentially, she's trying to just get you to realize, hey, anybody can do this. It has nothing to do with anything more than being aware of how to think.
She brought up how experts see the world, and during her bringing up how experts see the world, she brought up the scientific method. And for people that aren't familiar with the scientific method, you design an experiment to test a hypothesis, and then you run the experiments, and then you see if the results match your expectation. And scientists use that to rework their hypothesis, and they observe different things. And I just thought that was very interesting, like to explain her thinking, like using how scientists, people who are really smart people who they get thoughts and they don't just run with those thoughts. They actually test these thoughts out, and then they get their observations and then go back if something wasn't right and retest it again. And I just thought using the scientific method as a thinking was really great, because you get a thought, you go, look for facts to see if that thought is correct, and then you go back and keep on going back until you come to a conclusion that is, verified and acceptable.
And something she mentions too with the scientific method is sometimes we start by absorbing, and sometimes we don't have an initial thought first, which is okay because we just observe first, and then we can formulate thoughts, before we start just having instantaneous opinions and such. We formulate our process, we observe, and then we can actually have a testable hypothesis, and we can move on from that.
Well, yeah, I think she is bringing some of the sort of scientific reasoning up, but then you can't do that for everything that's day-to-day affairs. But nevertheless, by having, let's say, this idealistic image in your head, here's the scientific method, and you're trying to realize, wait a second, I can question something, I can think through whether or not the information I have is verifiably true, and from that I can reach some sort of a conclusion, so that even though you don't have to be an extreme scientist, you can apply some of the reasoning skills at a day-by-day basis and sort of hold this okay, this helps me to think something through. Later on in the book, for example, she brings up the role of imagination and says how important it is to have an imagination, and how do we get there. And then she's trying to lay out some sort of way of developing, okay, what do I mean by imagination, and how does it help, and how do we achieve?
Yeah, using past observations to make future deductions is basically the gist of that, how she views imagination.
And through that, she's also saying what imagination does is you always have to stop again and question your assumptions, okay? We use terminologies. Let's say on television they use a term like somebody says big government. And instead of you just accept it and say it, so now it automatically creates a bad image of how you see government in general because you use the term big government. She's not using it in the book, but I'm saying it's a common term that sometimes you see on television, and as a result, you stop and say, oh, well, I used the term, what does it mean exactly? And just by stopping and saying, what does it mean, it helps you to start to maybe think a bit differently and see something differently, because she talks about that. She calls them target words, and she says sometimes people use words, and if they don't stop and realize they're using just a word and question what word did I use, that automatically can create sort of a certain way of me seeing something, and I need to back up and just say, well, I used this word or I used a term, let me stop and think about it.
Yeah, she mentions about how words can completely influence our perception of things, and that's completely true. Like with the big government example, there's also more examples like the way we see Planned Parenthood, for instance, the program, how newspapers they decide to present this, where these are headlines such as Planned Parenthood kills more babies than guns, or Planned Parenthood is legal and affordable to women's care. Like it's all in the way they worded it and how those words can affect us, and it perceives our perception of things, and we have to not like just fall into those kind of sort of clickbaits, and we have to, as simple as just Google, like searching and actually figuring out what Planned Parenthood is first, actually understanding the core of the program, and then we're able to formulate our opinions about how this affects us personally or how it affects our family and such. But it starts with just learning, like in this specific example, the core essentials of Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, it's one of those words that it's evil to some and it's great to others.
Yeah.
There's little middle ground.
It's like very diverged.
One of the ways she also then brought up how Holmes might provide us with some insight about how to think is that he exaggerates his ignorance, which was an odd thing to say. It's not that he's really ignorant, but that by him saying, well, I don't know, it forces him to start to learn something rather than, oh, I know what I'm doing, and just sort of charge ahead. And so she spends some time talking about, that he goes around and doing this frequently, going, well, I don't know something, I don't know it, I'm completely ignorant of it. But it's a way for him to sort of then start the process of him looking at something all over again. And so I thought that was an interesting aspect of the book. The other thing I thought was interesting is she also talked about detachment, how Holmes tries to look at something but step back from it. And so by not being too close to it, you can look at something. In this case, he goes to see a murder scene, for example, and he's trying to back up just to not just take a look at the dead body or the blood on the floor or a broken mirror, but to back up and say, what am I'm looking at and what should I be looking at? Sort of different ways of having a sense of looking at something.
Yeah, when you said, what am I looking at and what I should be looking at, I wanted to bring up Holmes' concept of a memory addict, and which he uses that to explain his useful way of thinking about human memory, and how memory is considered to be a resource into which memories themselves can be deposited and retrieved. So I thought his concept of memory addict went right along with saying, what am I looking at and what I should be looking at. And I feel like that derived from, people's memory and, remembering what was there before and, what's there now.
It also allows us, when we step back and not be so close to it, it allows us to see what the author mentions, something as invisible to the rest of us and something not so obvious. It lets us see a broader general idea and rather just be so focused on a certain point and a certain evidence where we can see and connect the whole picture.
Yeah, I think that's what she was referring to when she was talking about the three-pipe problem. So they'd be thinking directly for a long period of time in the event that they'd only smoke one pipe and the amount of time it would take to smoke three because they're so concentrated.
Yeah, that pipe smoking, and he would see that as a way of helping him to become detached and move back so he can think, what was I not seeing? What was I not thinking about? Same thing with him playing the violin, because he can therefore go, well, let me just pick up my violin, and I start to play it, and now I'm detaching myself from this, that I just can't keep looking at this, I gotta back away from it, and I start to see it maybe in different ways. Maybe I begin to ask myself different questions. And again, that's how she's trying to show you how anybody can do this, that you go through this process of thinking things through, and how do we sort of think like Sherlock Holmes. And it's basically what the whole book is trying to get you to do, is it's sort of just a sense of awareness to think about how you think, which is not, I think, normal. People don't really, they just charge ahead and want to start to do something, but sometimes you have to relearn things to do it better.
There was a quote in the book that I thought was very interesting, and it was saying that a policeman sees the crime scene and not the criminal, and I did not agree with that. Being a black woman, like, there's a lot of things happening in the news and just in the world today that if I committed a crime or I was accused of doing something, I don't think the police officer is going to see the crime scene or anything like that. They're just going to look at me and see that I fit a stereotype and just put me in that. So I just thought that quote was, like, really interesting, and I did not agree with that quote at all.
I guess it was like supposed to be set in 19th century England, though.
Yeah, I guess so.
Less diverse.
Yeah, and she also mentions that we're just wired for quick judgment. It's just something, even like she shows the pictures of two gentlemen, and it's just like, who are we most likely to vote? And it's just quick judgment. And we're not thinking past that as we should be.
Yeah, and that was, again, one of the things she's saying we need to avoid. Now, we only have a few minutes left, so what do you think of the book, and do you recommend that the viewers read it?
I thought the book was a good book, but I would not recommend it to a person who's not familiar with Sherlock Holmes, because she wants us to think like Sherlock Holmes. And if you don't know who Sherlock Holmes is, then you're not going to be able to, to think about him. So I would recommend this to Sherlock Holmes fans, of course.
Yeah, if you're not a fan of psychology, I wouldn't recommend it, because it's not, unlike most of the books, like you said, it's not very political, and does involve a lot of thought-provoking statements and questions, and it makes people question how they interact with people and make judgments and process information. And thankfully, the tone's not very condescending, and it's pretty constructive, but still, it's certainly not for everyone. It could be construed as boring for some.
Yeah, I think this book brings upon awareness of being able to think outside what's so familiar to you and just expand your thinking. And it could be political, and it cannot be political, depending on like where you're looking at. And that's the whole point, is to look at a different perspective. It can be just as simple as teachers reading this book and just saying, how am I teaching? How am I actually affecting my students? Are my students engaged? Just simple questions like that. And definitely it would be a great book to for people who are troubles seeing a different opinion, or people who are just default by ignorant, not like Sherlock Holmes, who he is, who's wanting to be ignorant to learn, to accumulate more knowledge.
I like the book. I like books that look at the issue of trying to teach you how to think about thinking, is basically what it is, because then they do help you to sort of think through, well, how am I thinking about something? Gee, maybe this gives me some insight into how to look at a problem differently. And so whether I'm applying it to me trying to do research on an article I'm writing, or whether I'm looking at my golf game and realizing I've been golfing a certain way for so long, how come I'm not improving, so that you do these things. So the book is certainly useful in that sense, and I've noticed myself taking things from this book to apply it to sort of a broader way of doing things. And so I think readers out there, you may enjoy it. Thank you for joining us today.